Hey everyone, it's Josh over here with the Manchise, and today we are going to be breaking down UFC on ESPN 14, Robert Whittaker versus Darren Till, also known as Fight Island number 3, right? I believe it's the third card on Fight Island here, or Fight Night number 3 on Fight Island. Either way, man, very excited for this fight card again. UFC is just doing a really good job putting together some pretty crazy stacked UFC cards. And we're going to change it up for this week's episode. And the reason for that is because, I mean, the last video was close to 2 hours long. And we're going over like all sorts of things like the fighters' records and their heights and their reach. And I'm putting the Tapology screenshot up on the screen anyway. So unless you're blind or listening to this on a podcast, which by the way I am, you are able to listen to this on Spotify, so check that out if that's what your preference is over a video. But either way, all of that stuff is right there for you. So I want to get down right into some analysis, my prediction for the fight, whether or not I lean one way when it comes to just betting, and then of course where we make our money each week, DFS, what my ideal lineup would be. Am I fading fighters? Are they a fighter that I'm targeting? We're going to get into all of that. And, we're going to keep the hot streak going, man. I've been doing really, really well in GPPs and tournaments over the past couple weeks, really since the UFC has resumed. Another great week last week for me. I had Joel Alvarez in just about all of my lineups. I did take a couple tough L's with Davi Ramos, but I said in that fight, Sarukian was either going to win by decision or Ramos would finish him. And Ramos had a couple chances there to pull off a submission, but Sarukian was just too slick, was able to avoid the danger. But either way, Joel Alvarez, Jack Hermanson, Figueiredo, I mean, I was money on that card, and I'm looking to be money again. So let's get right down into the first fight, which is a fight at the 135 bantamweight division. Nathaniel Wood fighting John Castaneda, and John Castaneda is taking this fight on short notice. John Castaneda fought for Combat America. Obviously, Nathaniel Wood has been in the UFC for a little while now. Was really looking to be a top prospect up until about 5 months ago when he was knocked out by John Dodson. And Dodson's basically a gatekeeper at this point. He's still fringe top 5 fighter in the bantamweight, and he's just a tough opponent, tough draw for anyone. So though Nathaniel Wood got knocked out in that fight, I don't think that's necessarily a black mark on his record, man. It's a tough fight, and it was really a big step up in competition for him. In this fight against John Castaneda, as I mentioned, Castaneda's taking this fight on short notice. Nathaniel Wood is a big favorite. Just pulling up the odds here. As of right now, he is minus 475. Castaneda is plus 380. I want to talk about some things here with this fight. I think the first thing is it's pretty obvious that Nathaniel Wood is going to be a big favorite in this fight, right? Because he's really fared well in both Cage Warriors and the UFC outside of his last fight. And he was on a little bit of a streak there, and not just fighting well, but finishing opponents, staggering them on their feet. And then the thing that I really like about Nathaniel Wood is he's not the type of guy that's just gonna get top control and kind of grind out the rest of the round. Like, he's always looking for a finish, man. And so far in the UFC, he's had a few subs. He's had a Darce choke, rear naked choke, actually a couple rear naked chokes. So he's a guy that can definitely catch you standing, but then has really slick jiu-jitsu skills on the ground. On the flip side, John Castaneda, he is 1-2 over his last 3 fights for Combat America, and those were some tough fights though. I'm just looking here. It's not like he was finished in either of those fights. He lost 2 years ago to Jose Alday, who had a 10-3 record. That was a split decision loss. The fight before that, another tough opponent, Marroquin, 8-2 record. He lost that by decision as well. His most recent fight against Marcelo Rojo, who had a 15-5 record, he was able to sub him via arm triangle choke. So Castaneda, I mean, and Combat America, it's a decent organization. It's a solid organization. I mean, Castaneda trains with other UFC fighters. So even though he's taking this fight on short notice, he's not a slouch. He's definitely UFC caliber opponent for Nathaniel Wood, which is nice to see. I don't like the fact that he's taking this fight on short notice. And the other thing here is I don't think he has the same finishing ability that Nathaniel Wood has. So from a betting perspective here, Nathaniel Wood minus 500, you're not going to make a ton of money unless you're going to throw Nathaniel Wood into a parlay. You could bet a finish on this one, but Castaneda's a tough guy. I think Nathaniel Wood definitely wins the fight. I wouldn't be surprised if he's able to sub Castaneda, but if I had to take a guess, I honestly think Castaneda has the ability to survive 3 rounds. Now, I've watched Castaneda fight, and Castaneda's he's solid for the 135-pound division. He's decent everywhere, solid striking. He has the ability to take you down, so he definitely has some of that grappling background, but he's not really exceptional in any area. He doesn't have an exceptional power, exceptional technique when striking, exceptional jiu-jitsu, and that's where I really give the edge to Nathaniel Wood, because if he gets in top control, he really does have an exceptional ability to finish you, and we've seen that so far in the UFC. And he never was able to get there against John Dodson, but if he puts Castaneda in that position, Castaneda's probably going to struggle. The thing is, I don't know if Castaneda is going to be put in that position because his takedown defense is solid and his striking is decent as well. So what we've seen from Nathaniel Wood in the UFC is he has the ability to really, as I mentioned, stagger you on the feet, and then once it goes to the ground and you're a dazed opponent, take advantage of you and tap you. Don't know if that will happen here, but nonetheless, I would give Nathaniel Wood the nod. From a DraftKings and DFS perspective, just looking at the salaries here, Nathaniel Wood is one of the most expensive fighters on this card at $9,500. Castaneda is one of the cheapest at $6,700. I could see myself having a little bit of exposure to both these guys. I think I like Nathaniel Wood. He's high upside, especially in a card that has some other guys, which we're going to get into in the 9,000 range or price point, that I just don't love because I don't think they have a ton of finishing ability. Nathaniel Wood certainly does. So if you're going to pay up for a fighter at that 9,500 price point, Nathaniel Wood should definitely be someone you should consider. As far as Castaneda goes, he's not someone that I would entirely fade. And as I mentioned, the reason for that is because even though I don't think he's going to win the fight, he could survive 3 rounds and land a decent amount of significant strikes. If he's able to land, and when that happens often in those, the smaller weight classes like the bantamweight division at 135 pounds, if he can secure a takedown or two and land anywhere from 50 to 60 strikes, he should pay up for that 6,700 price point. And he's a guy that, you probably won't have a ton of cash. There's some pretty big favorites on this card. Khamzat Chimaev, Nathaniel Wood, Emiev, Gustafsson. I mean, these are all guys that you're probably going to have a few of those guys in your lineup, and you're going to need someone in the low 7s, high 6s to also throw in your lineup. And Castaneda is not a horrible option when I compare him to some of the other fighters at that price point. So we're going to move on to the next fight here, which of course is Ramazan Emeev versus Nicholas Stolze. Or Stolt? Not exactly sure how to pronounce it. My last name is Burkhardt. It's German, but I obviously don't speak German. So Ramazan Emeev is a veteran in the UFC. He's had, I believe, 4 fights in the UFC so far, and he is 1-3 in those fights. He has a decision win over Sam Alvey. Decision win versus Alberto Mina. Decision win versus Stefan Sekulic. And he lost a decision. That was a close fight to Anthony Rocco Martin, where Emeev kind of came out hot and it looked like he was really going to be controlling that fight, but Rocco Martin picked it up in the later rounds and ended up stealing that victory. On the flip side, Nicholas Stolze, he's fought for BA, MMA, and some other organizations, kind of jumped around. In all honesty, I haven't gotten to watch a ton of him. Leading up to this fight, me doing some research, I was able to watch him fight a few times, and I think he's going to be at a disadvantage here against Emeev. The thing is, Emeev, though, hasn't really shown, at least in the UFC thus far, that he has the ability to finish fighters. I mean, Sam Alvey's sort of tough, but he's been finished before. Alberto Mina was 13-0 when he fought Emeev, and not a ton of UFC experience, so not much to talk about there. Stefan Sekulic, again, another guy that didn't have a ton of UFC experience. So Emeev so far in the UFC, the opponents that he's fought that have a ton of UFC experience, like Rocco Martin and Sam Alvey, he hasn't been able to put up. Those fights have gone to decision. And even the fights that he's had against less experienced fighters in the UFC, he hasn't been able to finish those guys either. So Nicholas Stolze, his last 4 fights, he has been able to win. So he's on a nice little 4-fight win streak. Rear naked choke submission, rear naked choke submission, and a KO. And then just in his most recent fight against Omar Jesus Santana, who had a record of 16-5, he won that fight by unanimous decision. It's interesting that he has some of those subs, though, on his record because he's mostly a kickboxer. He has kickboxing experience, and he does have a little bit of a jiu-jitsu background, but watching him fight, it's not like he's a guy that goes in for the grapple, wants to take you down and submit you when you're on the ground. No, he's going to want to strike with Emeev here. And if he's smart, that's what he's going to try to do, to kind of keep the distance away from Emeev, because, you know, Emeev has that Dagestani background, and he should really have a grappling edge here. I want to pull up some stats on Emeev. 1.5 takedowns per 15 minutes, with only a 22% takedown accuracy. So those numbers don't seem great. 80% takedown defense, though, which is really solid. I just think Emeev has advantages across the board, very similar to what we talked about with the last fight with Nathaniel Wood, where I just think Nathaniel Wood's probably a better striker than Castaneda, better at submission, better at jiu-jitsu, and I kind of feel the same way with Emeev. I think he's a better grappler. I think he's a better striker. I think he's going to be the stronger opponent, even though they're relatively the same size. Nicholas Stolze might be better at pure jiu-jitsu, but I don't ever see the fight going there. I think this is a tough one for Stolze. Emeev minus 375. I believe that's what the fight opened up as. Yeah, and now he's all the way to minus 400. Again, not someone I would plan on betting on, even though he should win this fight comfortably. But again, he's another guy that you might want to throw into a parlay. Nicholas Stolze, I don't want anything to do with him in this fight, making his UFC debut and fighting. Honestly, German fighters have not had a ton of success in the UFC, and I think it has to do with MMA not really catching on in some of those European countries till a little bit later. So they're behind the curve, trying to catch up with Russia and the United States and Brazil when it comes to their level of competition in MMA. When it comes to DraftKings, though, don't really expect to have a ton of exposure to either of these fighters. Emeev is 9,400, and again, at that price point, I'd rather have Nathaniel Wood. I'd rather have Gustafsson, which we'll talk about later. And then for Nicholas Stolze, 6,800, just not doing much for me there because I don't really see Stolze having an opportunity to win this fight. I mean, I don't see him finishing Emeev, and I don't see him out grappling or out striking Ameev either. So I'm going to fade Stolze. There's guys in the low 7s, high 6s that I would prefer. Not going to have a ton of either of those guys. So we'll move on to the next fight here, which is a female fight in the bantamweight division, 135 pounds. Bethe Correia versus Pannie Kianzad, or Kanzad. Not exactly sure. Kinzad. We'll just say Kinzad. Make it easy. Bethe Correia's 11-4 professional record versus Pannie Kianzad, who's 12-5. This is going to be an even fight. I mean, I'm just looking at Bethe Correia, who hasn't fared that well in the UFC as of late, but she's really fought some tough competition. 10 months ago, she beat Sijara Eubanks, and she was a dog in that fight. She was really stifled early on in the first round, but Sijara Eubanks gassed, and Bethe Correia definitely had an advantage from a striking standpoint, was able to pick things up in the latter rounds there and squeak out a victory. Before that, she was subbed by Irene Aldana, who, you know, in the 135-pound division, she's probably up next for a title. Bethe Correia was knocked out, that ridiculous head kick by Holly Holm, one of the greatest female MMA fighters ever. And then there was a decision draw in there against Marion Renault, who's a tough opponent as well. So, you know, Bethe Correia, she also has a win over Jessica Eye. Now, I think that was like 3 or 4 years ago. But, you know, Bethe Correia, when she's fought talent around that's up to her skill level, she's done really well. When she's fought girls like Holly Holm and, you know, Ronda Rousey, she had that title fight against Ronda Rousey, she was dominated. So the good thing about this fight is, from what I believe, Pannie Kianzad, she's probably at Bethe Correia's level when it comes to skill. Now, Vegas views Pannie as the favorite here, but it's pretty much a toss-up. Pannie Kianzad -150, Bethe Correia +130. Pannie Kianzad so far in the UFC, she's 2-2. She lost to Macy Chiasson, and who doesn't? That girl's just a total beast. She was subbed, rear naked choke. She beat Jessica Rose Clark in her most recent fight. That was 8 months ago. She also has a loss to Julia Alvia. But, you know, these are tough opponents here. Yeah, I mean, wow. So she's fought some pretty tough opponents too. So this will be a good one because you have two opponents here that are used to fighting females that are probably at a higher skill level, and now these guys should be a little bit more evenly matched. So we'll get a good read as to who the better overall fighter is. I think in this one, you know, Pannie has a little bit of a size advantage, and she definitely has a grappling advantage as well. I want to pull up the stats. We'll just take a peek at those. You know, these girls are even. 4.47 significant strikes landed per minute for Correia, 44% striking accuracy, 4.28 strikes absorbed, and for Pannie, 4.03 strikes landed per minute, 41% striking accuracy, 3.71 strikes absorbed. Bethe Correia nor Pannie Kianzad really, I mean, they're going to strike, but the difference when it comes to grappling is Pannie Kianzad hasn't been taken down in the UFC yet. Bethe Correia, though, 84% takedown defense is actually pretty solid, so I expect this one to stay standing. And for that reason, I would probably lean Bethe Correia in this fight. I think she has more experience against top-level opponents. And, you know, when you fought Holly Holm and you fought Irene Aldana, I mean, those girls are just legit strikers. And she took L's in those fights, but if she's learning and getting better, and I think we did see that in her most recent performance against Sijara Eubanks, I think that can carry over into this fight against Pannie Kianzad. So from a betting perspective, Betch Kohei at plus 130 is not bad. She's a decent dog on this card. When it comes to DraftKings, I'll probably stay clear. I won't have too much exposure in this fight. And I called it, by the way, last weekend when I talked about Lipsky versus Carolina, how I really liked Lipsky in that fight, but I probably wouldn't have any exposure. And, it came back to bite me because Lipsky ended up being in the optimal lineup. But, again, I don't expect this fight to end in a finish just because I think these two girls are so evenly matched, and therefore I'll stay away. Betch Kohei at 7,800 isn't a horrible option. What makes it difficult, though, is if you're, buying into Darren Till winning this main event slot, 7,900, 5-round fight, you'd rather pay up the extra $100 to throw Darren Till in your lineup. At 7,800, the mid-sevens are tough this week, and we're going to talk a lot about that price point. You're going to have to kind of pick your poison there. Which fighters do you think can come away with a victory? And I think Betch Kohei is certainly one of them. So I might have a little bit of exposure to her, but I believe there may be better options. So we'll talk about that. The thing is, I don't see a ton of opportunity for a finish here. And then also because these girls are both strikers, you're going to need a ton of output over 3 rounds plus a victory in a close matchup. There's just too many variables at play when it comes to getting a significant output from one of these fighters. And I think there's a few other fighters in the mid-7,000s like Jai Herbert, which we'll talk about, that I think have more of an opportunity for a finish, or at the very least, more points scored when it comes to DFS. All right. So we will move on to the next fight here, which is in the heavyweight division, and it's Tanner Boser versus Rafael Pessoa. Rafael Pessoa is 10-1, and he is 1-1 in the UFC. Let me just check that. Yes, 1-1 in the UFC so far. He lost his UFC debut to Cyril Gane, or Gain. I don't know. The dude's a beast. He trains with Francis Ngannou. Cyril Gane, yeah, I think it's just Gane. Cyril Gane is just a stud. So talk about a tough welcoming to the UFC. And then his most recent fight was against Jeff Hughes, which was about 8 months ago. He won that fight via decision. Jeff Hughes so far he was good outside of the UFC, but hasn't had a ton of success in the UFC. For Tanner Boser, he just fought 3 weeks ago, and he knocked out Felipe Lins, and that was very impressive. And I had some Tanner Boser shares in that one. So that was after Felipe Lins lost to Andrei Arlovsky. It was hard not to target Tanner Boser. So yeah, he knocked out Felipe Lins. Previous to that fight, he fought Cyril Gane as well and lost that fight unanimous decision. So these guys both have a common opponent. The difference is Tanner Boser was able to survive, go the distance against Cyril Gane, whereas Pessoa was finished. Boser also has victories over Daniel Spitz in his UFC debut, so 2-1 record here. Let's look at the betting odds. Tanner Boser is minus 260. Rafael Pessoa is plus 220, and I think that makes sense here. I really like Tanner Boser in this spot. I think he's by far the better striker. Now, he definitely has a reach disadvantage, and I think he's an inch shorter. So, but Pessoa doesn't have a ton of, I don't want to say he doesn't have a ton of power, but he's not the most dangerous striker. You're not going to see a ton of output from him. I would not be comfortable betting Pessoa. Now, if this fight goes to the ground, Pessoa probably has better jiu-jitsu skills. We haven't really seen it too much, at least in the UFC, but he does have a submission victory on his professional record. That is definitely not Tanner Boser's game. He's a guy that's going to want to strike, leg kicks, bring the pressure. and really land a significant amount of strikes. So let's look at the stats for that fight. Tanner Boser, 4.28 significant strikes landed per minute, 50% striking accuracy, and 100, whoa, I didn't mean to say that, 3.15 strikes absorbed per minute. I had gone past the striking stats and saw that he had a 100% takedown defense. So yes, I'll point that out as well. Tanner Boser, 100% takedown defense. For Rafael Pessoa, 2.4 significant strikes landed per minute, 25% striking accuracy, 2.55 strikes absorbed per minute. Neither of these guys have takedowns in the UFC, but both of them have a 100% takedown defense. So I don't see this fight getting to the ground at all. This is a fight that's going to take place on the feet. And for that, I have to give the nod to Boser. I think, especially because Pessoa is kind of heavy on that front foot, so you're going to see some of those calf kicks from Boser. And then I think he's going to start mixing in some combinations. And I think he has the ability to finish Pessoa. I don't know if I would necessarily bet on it, but either way, at least from a DraftKings and DFS perspective, I don't necessarily need a finish from Boser. I think it would be nice, but when you're talking about a high output, high volume striker in Tanner Boser, which is kind of rare in the heavyweight division these days, he's a guy that you can certainly slot into your lineup. So looking at his price point, he is 8,900. Rafael Pessoa is 7,300. I will not have any Pessoa shares, even if I thought he had a decent chance of winning. Again, he's just not a guy that strikes with enough output or, you know, grapples with enough takedown attempts in order for me to throw him in my lineup. Tanner Boser, I like at 8,900. I will certainly have him in a few lineups, but I wouldn't. I'm not going to have him in my what I think is my ideal lineup. So definitely get a little bit of exposure to Boser, and I would fade Rafael Pessoa. All right, so the next fight here is Movsar Evloev versus Mike Grundy, and this fight is taking place in the featherweight 145-pound division, and both these guys are hot prospects. So really this fight I am looking forward to, and I expect to have some exposure in it. So Movsar Evloev's 12-0 so far. He's also 2-0 in the UFC, came from M1, which is a pretty solid organization. Mike Grundy, on the other hand, he is 1-0 in the UFC, was able to knock out Nad Narimani. So both these guys really coming into the UFC, or coming into this bout pretty hot. Grundy's won his last 5 fights. Evloev's undefeated. So, you know, these guys, the winner of this fight is probably going to end up ranked. If they don't end up ranked, their next fight will be against a ranked opponent. When it comes to size, these guys are nearly identical. Both 5'7", 72-inch reach. So you're not going to see, neither fighter will really have too much of an advantage when it just comes to pure size. But Evloev is a pretty big favorite in this one. But I do want to talk a little bit about the odds, because the odds have certainly shifted. Evloev opened up as a pretty significant favorite in this fight, and I believe he was around like minus 275 or minus 260. Some money certainly was dropped on Mike Grundy, because now when I look at the odds, Evloev is minus 200, Grundy's plus 170. I can understand Vegas viewing Evloev as that big of a favorite, because so far he's just been super impressive over with M1, in the UFC, wherever the fight goes, he seems to have an answer and he seems to dominate. If it stays on the feet, you know, he fights, or he trains out of Tiger Muay Thai, so he's definitely well versed when it comes to that Thai style of fighting. And then he's Russian, so he also has a really big grappling background, and we've seen that. He's able to take you down. He's able to pressure you, control you on the ground. He just really looks sharp and sound in all areas. Mike Grundy, on the other hand, is really known for his wrestling. And I've watched a ton of Grundy before he got to the UFC. And in fighting lesser competition, the strategy just seemed to be kind of repetitive there for Grundy. It was, you know, let's throw a few strikes, set up the level change, get that double leg takedown, and then once we get the fight to the mat, either ground and pound or try to sub the opponent. And which is why when I look at his record, I see a lot of, rear naked chokes and arm triangle submission victories, because he does have some pretty solid skills once it gets to the mat. The way I look at this fight is Evelev is probably the more skilled fighter in all areas except for one, and that one area is power. Mike Grundy, when he throws with some violent intentions, and if he catches you on the chin, especially for a 145 pounder, he can knock you out. Evelev hasn't had a ton of finishes yet. I mean, he's only had 2 UFC fights, but both of those went to decision. Now, he dominated those fights. He dominated Barzola. Yeah, he fought Enrique Barzola 8 months ago. He dominated Sung Woo Choi in his UFC debut, but he didn't finish those guys. He basically had a pretty significant advantage striking, and then whenever those opponents tried to close the distance, he was able to come out on top from a grappling standpoint and apply a ton of pressure and really just kind of control the fight from that point on. Whereas Grundy, in his UFC debut, they paired him up against another guy with a wrestling background in Narimani, and in the second round, he was able to catch him with, I believe, an overhand right. Then he faked a level change, came across with an overhand right, and was able to drop Narimani. I think at this point, Evelev minus 200 isn't a horrible bet with that line swinging the way it has. And I'm a little bit surprised. Now, I know Darren Till's on this card, Tom Aspinall's on this card, and Grundy trains with both of those guys. So, this is a big card for that gym. Team Calban, Liverpool. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. I think it's Team Calban. So this is a big spot for those guys. And like I said, this is a big fight. One of these guys is going to get a ranked opponent. Whoever wins this fight will end up getting a ranked opponent. I think Grundy could certainly catch Evelev here. But as I mentioned, Evelev's the better fighter across the board. But here's the thing. When I pull up the stats for this fight, and again, we're not going to get the greatest stats because Grundy only had 1 fight in the UFC, but he was able to stuff 100% of the takedowns by Narimani. And when I look at Evelev, even though he's dominated his fights, he has been taken down in the UFC. Barzola was able to take him down at points. So he has a really good takedown defense at 85%. But if I had to give the grappling edge one way versus the other, I'm telling you Evelev is the better offensive grappler. But defensively, he's shown that he's capable of being taken down. And if Grundy can take down Evelev, then that will really swing the tides here in his favor. So this is a fight where I'm not surprised the odds adjusted, because from, on paper, it looks like Evelev has a big advantage really in all areas and is the more well-rounded fighter. But wrestling really is the great equalizer here. And if Grundy has the ability to out-wrestle Evelev and take him down, then he has a good chance of winning this fight. So when I look at this from a betting perspective, I would probably stay away, or I would lean Evelev. But when I look at it from a DFS perspective, I am looking at it the complete opposite, right? Because there we have to take into account salaries. And when I'm looking at fighters in the low 7,000s, Fabricio Verdum, Jesse Ronson, Nicholas Stolza, Castaneda, none of those guys have the same upside as Mike Grundy, which means I will probably end up having a ton of Mike Grundy exposure. It's kind of similar to my breakdown from last weekend where I liked Davi Ramos, because if someone was going to get a finish in that fight, and I stand by it, it would be Davi Ramos. I mean, you saw the guy, he was absolutely brutalized on the feet, but at no point was he really in that much danger, like he was to the point of being knocked out and finished. No, Sarukian just had a striking advantage and fought a smart fight. Evelev can do that as well and can certainly win the fight. But if Grundy's able to take him down, or if Evelev just leaves a slight window open for Grundy to take advantage of his power, and he cracks Evelev, you could see Grundy win this fight. And that's what I'm looking for when I'm talking about fighters in the low 7,000s, high 6,000s. I want guys that have, again, either a really good opportunity of winning the fight, or they have the chance to finish a fight. And I think Grundy has a chance to finish this fight with the power advantage that he has over Evelev. Like I said, Evelev hasn't lost a professional fight, and he really hasn't been tested. We don't know how good or bad his chin may be, but maybe we will find out Saturday night. Moving on to the next fight here, Jake Collier versus Tom Aspinall, which this fight is taking place in the heavyweight division. And this is Mike Grundy's teammate, as I mentioned. And this is interesting that it's taking place in the heavyweight division because Jake Collier hasn't really fought as a heavyweight in the UFC. And Jake Collier hasn't really fought in general. The last time he's fought was 3 years ago. Now, I think he was injured. He had surgery. He was suspended by USADA. He even contracted COVID. So, I mean, the odds are just really stacked against Jake Collier in this fight. He's moving up to a heavier division. He was sick, suspended, surgery, you name it. He's just been inactive. And so far in the UFC, he's 2-2, I believe. I could be wrong. He may have had a few more fights than that. Let me just check that out. I mean, he has been in the UFC for a little while. Yeah, so he's been in the UFC for a bit. So he lost his UFC debut to Vitor Miranda. That was to a head kick. Ricardo Abreu beat him. That just went to the decision. He lost to Dongji Yang, ground and pound, UFC Fight Night 79 in 2015. He was able to beat Alberto Uda, spinning back kick to the body. But his two most recent fights, and again, recent, because you're talking about 3 years ago, 2017, he lost to Devin Clark, that went the distance, and he was able to beat Marcel Fortuna. So he is coming off of a victory, technically. For Tom Aspinall has fought for Cage Warriors. He was 2-0 with Cage Warriors. Both those fights were knockouts. He's on a nice little 3-fight win streak, which is really bogus because his most recent loss, which was 4 years ago, he lost via DQ. He was disqualified for an illegal 12-6 elbow. So from what I know about Tom Aspinall is it's been pretty difficult for him to get opponents. And I understand it. I've watched him fight. I've watched both of his Cage Warrior fights. He's a pretty massive heavyweight. He's 6'5", solid 260 pounds, solid power, good striking, and with his, I don't know if he's really an excellent grappler, but just because of his size, he's not an easy opponent to take down. So from what I've heard, it's been a difficult time. It's been difficult to find opponents to fight Tom Aspinall, and Vegas odds kind of reflect everything that we've discussed so far, as Tom Aspinall is a pretty sizable favorite here at minus 230. Especially considering the fact that he's making his UFC debut against a UFC veteran in Jake Collier, who is plus 190. I just think size is going to be an issue in this fight. Collier's mostly fought at light heavyweight, but I also believe when he first came to the UFC, he was fighting at 185. So now he's just making this huge jump. He's going to be disadvantaged at a size standpoint, disadvantaged at just from a power standpoint, and then on top of that, the long layoff, the surgery, the USADA suspension. I mean, was the Collier that fought previously in the UFC the same Collier that was on performance-enhancing drugs? If so, he wasn't impressive back then, and if he's off of them right now, then he might even be less of a fighter than he was back then. So, I don't like Jake Collier at all here. Minus 230, minus 225, depending on who you're using for your sports book. I feel pretty comfortable taking Aspinall there, and I would feel really comfortable taking Aspinall to finish this fight via knockout. I think he KOs Jake Collier. When it comes to DraftKings, I really like Aspinall. I'm going to have a ton of ownership of him there at 8,800 salary. Again, the high 8s, low 9s is weird this week. You have Shogun Hua. You have Evelev, who we just talked about, at 9,100. You have Nicholas Dalby, 9,200. None of those guys really have the same finishing potential as Aspinall. So if you're looking at buying or paying up to that high $8,000 salary range, Tanner Boser's a good option. Tom Aspinall, in my opinion, is a better option, and you can get him for $100 cheaper. And if you're looking to fade the top guys like Chimaev and Nathaniel Wood, wouldn't be out of the question for me to have a card where, like, I have a couple of those fighters in the high 8 range, right? Like that mid-range card. And Aspinall and Boser would be two guys that I would certainly target. So I really like Aspinall in this fight. If you're a fan of those like captain mode late entries, he's a under the radar sleeper that you can kind of have set up as your captain. I did that also this past weekend with Delize, and it seemed to work out. I ended up cashing. So I really like Aspinall here. Moving on to the next fight. This will be taking place in the welterweight division, and it's Nicholas Dalby versus Jesse Ronson. Jesse Ronson is taking this fight on short notice, I believe. And he's making his second UFC debut, I guess. So this is his second stint. He fought in the UFC. It's been about 5 or 6 years, I believe. So Dalby also is in his second UFC stint as well. Let me just check that. Yep. Dalby fought in the UFC. He lost to Peter Sabata, who's also on this card, and Zach Cummins. And then he went on to go to Cage Warriors. He was pretty successful there. And then his most recent fight in the UFC, fought Alex Oliveira, another guy, Brazilian cowboy, who's on this card. He won that fight by decision. That was towards the end of 2019. So it's been about 9 months since Dalby has fought. For Jesse Ronson, he recently fought for BTC. I have no idea what organization that is. He subbed Troy Lampson, who had a record of 13-3, and that was 4 months ago, rear naked choke. Prior to that, Ronson did have a stint with the PFL, so I was able to watch him there. He fought Natan Schulte, who won the PFL maybe the first year. In fact, he might have won both years. But he was able to survive against Natan. That went the distance. And then he lost to Nikolai Alexishkin. I don't know how to pronounce his name. He was knocked out. I believe that was ground and pound. So Ronson versus Dalby here. And again, we have Dalby being a pretty big favorite. If I look at the odds, Dalby is minus 255, Ronson's plus 215, and it makes sense. And there's a couple of reasons why it makes sense. The first is Dalby's moving up to welterweight. Even though these guys are basically the same size, Dalby's just a little bit thicker of a fighter, will also have a reach advantage. But Ronson's moving up. He's taking the fight on short notice, and he's just, again, he doesn't have a significant advantage anywhere in this fight. Dalby's a better striker. Dalby's a better grappler. Really, everywhere you turn, Dalby has an advantage. So I like Dalby in this fight. Now, minus 250. Minus 250. It's pretty penny for a guy that really doesn't have a ton of finishes. Or at least we haven't seen a ton of finishes from Dalby in the UFC yet. So, minus 250. Again, you could put a parlay together. Dalby, Aspinall, Boser, get a mix of some of those guys, and you'll make a little bit of money. I think this fight ultimately goes to the judges' scorecard here. I think this goes the distance. I think it's going to be a unanimous decision win for Nicholas Dalby. So I actually betting the overs isn't a bad idea. I just can't see myself putting any money behind Ronson. Feel the same way when it comes to DraftKings. Jesse Ronson is a super cheap option at $7,000. Not horrible if you need, again, just like I talked about earlier with Castaneda. If you're really tight building your lineup, like especially if you play cash and you want to hammer some of the big dogs here like Chimaev and Nathaniel Wood, Ronson and Castaneda are guys you can throw in there because I expect them to probably survive. I think Ronson has a better chance of going the distance than Castaneda. But yeah, I mean, the thing is Ronson just doesn't have a ton of upside here. In his 3 previous UFC fights, 29 fantasy points, 27 fantasy points, 27 fantasy points. Just not numbers that you like to see. But when you're looking at Dalby, who's 9,200, 68 fantasy points, 7 fantasy points, 29 fantasy points, 58 fantasy points. And I go all the way back to 2015 when he beat Zaleski dos Santos. He had 84 fantasy points. So I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to either of these fighters. In fact, I probably won't have any exposure to either of them. If you're paying $9,000 plus, you need finishing potential. Could Dalby finish Ronson? Yeah. Do I expect it to happen? Absolutely not. There are other guys in that price point that I think have a better chance, such as Nathaniel Wood, such as Alexander Gustafsson, which we will certainly talk about. So we'll move on to the next fight here, which is Francisco Trinaldo versus Jai Herbert, in what I think is one of the most intriguing fights on this card, taking place in the lightweight division, 155 pounds. Trinaldo's a veteran, 41 years old, been in the UFC a while, has fought some pretty good opponents. His last 5 UFC fights, he's 3-2. Those losses coming to James Vick and Alexander Hernandez, and he went the distance with both of those guys. The 3 victories, knocked out Evan Dunham, decision win against Bobby Green, and decision win versus John Makdessi. For Jai Herbert, he had the lightweight belt over for Cage Warriors. He's on a nice little win streak here with some finishes. KO'd Kane Carrozza, KO'd Jack Grant, KO'd Steve O'Keefe, knocked out Joe McColgan. Cage Warriors has solid talent, man, so that's impressive to see that. And like Steve O'Keefe, for example, Steve O'Keefe has some solid grappling. Jack Grant had a 15-4 record. This Jai Herbert guy, he's looking promising, but they're not doing him any favors, matching him up against the skilled veteran in Francisco Trinaldo. Francisco Trinaldo is really a good fighter everywhere. And the shocking thing is, for someone who's 41 years old, his gas tank is solid. It's solid. Really good grappler, especially if he can get you on the ground. Great top control. Not too much of a threat to pull subs, but if you don't know what you're doing on the ground, he could sub you. Trinaldo doesn't have a ton of power, but he's just solid everywhere. For Herbert, Herbert's got a boxing background. Definitely will have a striking advantage in this fight. He also probably has an advantage when it comes to jiu-jitsu. He's been able to submit some guys over with Cage Warriors. The thing here, though, is, and I talked about this earlier with Grundy, wrestling's the great equalizer here. if Jai Herbert, who has had some trouble, Steve O'Keefe was able to take him down in Cage Warriors. He's had some trouble preventing takedowns. If that carries over into the UFC here against Trinaldo, he's going to be in for a rude awakening and a long night. And I could definitely see Trinaldo kind of grinding out a sloppy victory where he just shoots in for double legs and doesn't have a ton of output but controls the fight on the ground. If Jai Herbert can stuff some of those takedowns, then this becomes a totally different fight. Because Herbert is going to have a striking advantage. And, he's the younger, fresher fighter. He's 32 years old fighting a 41-year-old. So I would expect more output if this fight stays standing. Now, the odds in this fight are pretty close. Trinaldo is minus 145 at this point. Jai Herbert's plus 125. So there's been a little bit of money behind Jai Herbert, and it doesn't surprise me. At first, when I saw this fight and I watched some of Jai Herbert's footage from Cage Warriors, I was concerned for Herbert. I was concerned because of his takedown defense. But in those fights, he was always able to scramble and get back up to the feet. Now, were any of the opponents that he was fighting in Cage Warriors really as skilled as Trinaldo? Probably not. But as long as Herbert continues to progress in that area and improve, then that's what I want to see. Because I'm pretty confident if this fight stays standing that Herbert has an edge here, and he has a chance to finish Trinaldo. We haven't really seen Trinaldo finished recently in the UFC. He has been a durable opponent, but again, he's 41 years old. I mean, he'll almost be 42 years old. So, I mean, how long can that chin hold up? Will we start to see the decline from Francisco Trinaldo? And I think we might. So I like Jai Herbert as a slight underdog here at like plus 125, plus 130, depending on where you get it. And when it comes to DraftKings, really the same idea here. If I am paying for someone in the mid 7,000s, I am going to be targeting Jai Herbert. And I think he'll probably be owned at a pretty good clip, probably around 25-30%. But Jai Herbert's a guy that could finish this fight standing, could finish this fight via submission. And even if he loses, I don't see Trinaldo finishing him. So I think it would go the distance. So I really like Jai Herbert here. I'm definitely going to have a ton of exposure of Jai Herbert at 7,700. For Trinaldo at 8,500, price is just a little too rich for my blood. I'd rather have Robert Whittaker, who's a little bit cheaper. And then again, if you pay a little bit more money, you could get a guy like Aspinall or Boser in your lineup, and I think they have easier matchups. So I will be fading Trinaldo 100% here. Again, it's nothing against him because I think he's a good fighter. He's been around a while, but at this point in his career, he's mostly a decision merchant. So 8,500, I think he can do better on this slate. All right, we're going to keep it cooking here with the main event on the prelims, or the featured event on the prelims. Khamzat Chimaev versus Rhys McKee. And the first thing I need to say is, who is Rhys McKee's manager? And why did they talk him or not talk him out of taking this fight against Khamzat Chimaev? And I understand Chimaev has a crazy turnaround here. Just fought 10 days ago. But, I mean, did you watch that fight, McKee? Did you watch that fight? Did you see how ridiculously good Chimaev is? And I told you guys to have a ton of exposure of Chimaev against Phillips, because Phillips just has no takedown defense. And, it was just very easy to see and analyze that fight, that Chimaev would eventually get it to the ground and just either ground and pound him or choke him out, and he did a little bit of both, in all honesty. Chimaev undefeated up into this point and just finishing everyone left and right. Finished people for Brave, now finished John Phillips in the UFC. I haven't really seen a flaw in his game to this point. For Rhys McKee, he's been pretty successful for Cage Warriors. On a nice little 3-fight win streak, he beat Jefferson George, knocked him out. He beat Perry Andre Goodwin, subbed him, guillotine choke, and then he fought Hakan Foss and knocked him out. But, the three of those guys, it's not like they had, sparkling records. George was 9-6, Goodwin 8-5, Foss was 9-7. So that's really the level of competition that you're seeing there. Before that, he did fight for BA MMA. He beat Tim Barnett, knocked him out, which was kind of a revenge fight. I think the first time they fought, he lost. So one of his losses was to Tim Barnett. And then his last fight for BA MMA, he fought Terry Brazier, and he lost that fight decision unanimously. And what happened in that fight? Terry Brazier was able to grapple him, take him down, and kind of just grind him out, which is a huge concern if you're a Rhys McKee fan here. Rhys McKee has some pretty solid striking, and I only say pretty solid because I have to take into account his level of competition, which I don't think has been that great. But here's, this is what it comes down to. There's a couple things. Chimaev's the bigger fighter. This fight is taking place at 170. Chimaev has fought 185ers. He's going to have a reach advantage. He's going to have a height advantage. McKee is just not... He's not very muscular. So he's tall, he's long, he's not really lanky, but, his body frame, I just don't see Chimaev having any trouble taking him down. I don't think McKee's going to be able to stop those takedowns. Poor Rhys McKee in this one. This is a tough UFC debut. What I expect here is Chimaev, and not just me, everyone. I mean, again, let's look at the Vegas odds. Chimaev's minus 1,200. McKee plus 775. So, there's no money to be made on this fight whatsoever. The only thing that we really need to talk about here is, what do you do in DraftKings? I'm not going to sit here and talk until I'm blue in the face about how Chimaev is going to dominate this fight, and I expect him to take down McKee in the first round and either sub him or finish him with ground strikes. But what I do want to talk about is DraftKings and how to approach this fight. Obviously, right off the bat, we're fading McKee. Even being the lowest priced fighter on this card, there's better punt options. 6,400. McKee could go out there and put up 1 or 2 fantasy points. But when it comes to Chimaev, 9,800. That's one of the highest priced fighters you will ever see on a DraftKings slate. And the question becomes, do you put him in your lineup or do you fade him and look elsewhere? And really this all comes down to roster construction. I have a hard time fading him on this card. And the reason for that is because of the other fighters in the 9,000 range. I think you have Gustafsson, who's a good option. I think you have Nathaniel Wood, who's a good option. And then outside of those two guys, it's Chimaev. I'm not going to have a ton of exposure to Ameev. I'm not going to have any exposure to Dalby. I don't plan on having any Shogun exposure. So if I have to pay up for somebody in the 9,000 salary range, Chimaev is by far the best option. He's a guarantee for 100 points. Most likely going to be a first round finish. So you're going to probably get 90 right off the bat on DraftKings. But when it comes to roster construction, I guess the question becomes, how big of an impact would saving $300 to $500 go in your lineup? Because like I said, you could swap out Chimaev and you could put Nathaniel Wood in there, or swap out Chimaev and put in Gustafsson. Does that have a huge impact on constructing the ideal lineup? Now, with just the way I'm leaning for some of these fights this week, it didn't have a huge impact. In fact, before Chimaev was on this card, I was already putting together lineups. And in that scenario, a lot of times I ended up with some salary left over. So as soon as Chimaev became an option, it was really easy for me to go back through some of my lineups and swap out guys like Nathaniel Wood for Chimaev. So I will have a lot of Chimaev exposure. But by having a lot of Chimaev exposure, you're resorting yourself to one of two things, and potentially a combination of both. One, you're going to have some exposure to a fighter in the high 6, low 7 range. Two, you're probably going to end up with 3 dogs in your lineup. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because underdogs win every week. You're always going to see multiple underdogs win every week. But it is definitely more difficult to select the correct underdogs than it is to select the correct favorites when it comes to DFS in MMA. Now, I think I have some of those dogs pointed out, and I have been really successful over the past few weeks with guys like Laziz and Joel Alvarez hitting these big dogs. And I think this week I have some of those guys. Like I said, I like Mike Grundy. I like Jai Herbert. Those are guys that Grundy 7,100, Jai Herbert 7,700. By having those types of fighters in your lineup, that affords you to be able to afford Khamzat Chimaev. So I will definitely have exposure to Khamzat Chimaev. And in fact, I even have him in my ideal lineup, but there will certainly be other lineups where I will be fading him. If you're playing FanDuel, you want Chimaev all day, right? Because he's only $20. He's actually cheaper than Robert Whittaker. But for DraftKings players, where I think it's a little bit more difficult when it comes to lineup construction, you are going to have to pick your poison. You're going to have to fade him and try to solidify a lineup with more favorites, or you roll with him and now you know you're going to have to hit on those dogs. All right, moving on to the next fight here, which is the first fight on the main card. Alex Oliveira, the Brazilian cowboy, versus Peter Sabota, German fighter that I believe fights out of Jamaica now, which is pretty cool. We haven't really seen much of Sabota lately. He hasn't fought in over 2 years when he was knocked out by Leon Edwards. But before that, he did have a nice little 2-fight win streak going on. He beat Nicholas Dalby, and he also was able to knock out Ben Saunders, which really probably doesn't seem like that impressive of a feat. But again, that was 3 years ago when Ben Saunders was still a pretty dangerous fighter. He's been in the UFC now for a while, Peter Sabota. I'm just looking at his UFC record. Let me pull that up. He's 4-2 in the UFC. It's just he just hasn't been very active since joining the UFC. For Alex Oliveira, it's the exact opposite. He's been pretty active, coming off of a split decision victory over Max Griffin. That was about 4 months ago. Before that, he did take 3 losses to Nicholas Dalby, Mike Perry, and Gunnar Nelson. Gunnar Nelson was the only one to finish them of the 3. Was able to sub him via rear naked choke. And Oliveira looked good in that fight, made a major mistake, and of course, Gunnar Nelson capitalized. Alex Oliveira, I think, has an advantage in this fight when it comes to striking and grappling. Sabota probably has an advantage in just pure jiu-jitsu. I don't know about translating that to MMA jiu-jitsu, but in pure jiu-jitsu, I would think Peter Sabata has an advantage. Alex Oliveira, though, the problem with him is I don't really like his fight IQ. He tends to engage in brawls, which is great if you're a fan. You love to watch him. He's super entertaining. But he also puts himself in some bad positions. You know, that fight against Gunnar Nelson, the fight against Mike Perry, which I was able to actually see. I was at that fight. I watched that fight live. You know, why would you engage in a clinch fight with a heavy hitting Mike Perry? It just makes no sense. So when I look at the Vegas odds here, they're a little bit tighter. Oliveira's minus 175, Peter Sabata's plus 155, but I think they could be even tighter, right? They have the common opponent in Dalby, and Sabata has a victory over Dalby, whereas Oliveira lost to Dalby. And that was recent. That was just 9 months ago. So what I would expect is this fight goes the distance. I don't see either of these fighters finishing each other. The thing with Sabata is not a ton of output. I want to take a look at his stats. 2.17 significant strikes landed per minute, 2.89 strikes absorbed per minute. For Oliveira, 2.8 significant strikes landed per minute, 50% striking accuracy, solid number there, 2.18 strikes absorbed per minute. When it comes to grappling, neither of these guys are, you know, Oliveira's 2.7 takedowns per 15, 1.75 for Sabata. Their takedown accuracy is a wash, 37% to 35%. Takedown defense, there is a little bit of a difference here. Sabata, 77%. Oliveira, 58%. So I see this fight mostly standing. Now, Sabata is a southpaw for what it's worth, but I think this fight remains on the feet. Neither of these guys are high output fighters. So another reason why I think it will go the distance. And for that reason, I like the underdog here. I like Peter Sabata at plus 150 because I just don't see Alex Oliveira having a huge advantage. Would it surprise me if he won the fight? Absolutely not. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if Sabata won the fight either. So if I'm going to bet on this fight, I'm going to bet on Sabata plus 150, or I'm going to bet on this fight going the distance. When it comes to DraftKings, I love Sabata here. Love Sabata here because I feel like he's just so safe for that 7,500 price point, right? Because I think this goes the distance. I think he has a good chance of winning, and you know, he's been pretty successful recently in the UFC. Outside of losing that fight to Leon Edwards where he was knocked out, put up 123 spot against Ben Saunders, 95 against Dalby. And again, there wasn't even a finish there. But he was able to land about 40 significant strikes, had a knockdown, had a few takedowns there. So, you know, he's just, you kind of know what you're getting from both of these fighters. When it comes to Alex Oliveira, that 8,700 price point, it's not horrible. We just haven't seen a ton of fantasy points from him lately. 61 points against Max Griffin, 27 against Dalby, 24 against Perry, 23 against Nelson. You know, he did beat Pedersoli and Condit in 2018. He had pretty good numbers there, 94 points, 102 points. Those were finishes. So you just know what you're going to get from Oliveira here. If you need him to score, you know, close to 100 points, which is what you're looking for if you're paying 8,700, then you know that you need a finish. If he doesn't get a finish, you're not going to see a ton of takedowns, and you're not going to see a ton of output, so you're looking at probably somewhere around 65 fantasy points, which is not what you want for someone that you're paying 8,700 for. So I really like Sabata here. I'm going to have probably a ton of exposure to him. Hopefully comes away with a win because he's pretty sizable dog. And again, in lineups where I'm having exposure to guys like Chimaev, Nathaniel Wood, and Alexander Gustafsson, I need dogs that are in that low 7, mid 7 price point, and Sabata is certainly one of them. All right, moving on to the next fight on the main card, Paul Craig versus Gadzimirad Antigulov. I can't wait for this fight, said no one ever. I don't know, maybe there's a couple Paul Craig fans out there, the Bear Jew. Guess he's exciting. Antigulov hasn't been very exciting in the UFC so far. This fight's happening at the light heavyweight division. I like Paul Craig. I think he's a decent guy. He's entertaining, but I don't expect this fight to be entertaining at all. Not really sure why this is on the main card, in all honesty. Especially because it's not like either of these guys are coming off some big victory. Antigulov has lost his last 2 UFC fights, and he was knocked out in both of them. He was knocked out by Jan Kutalaba, and he was knocked out by Michael Oleksiejczuk. So, 2 fights that he's been KO'd, and those fights took place like over a year ago. Before that, he did have victories in the UFC over Marcos Rogerio de Lima. He subbed him guillotine choke, and Joaquin Christensen subbed him rear naked choke. For Paul Craig, his most recent fight, of course, was against Shogun Rua. That was a split decision fight. Rua kind of gassed out, and that was the first time that I really got to see a ton of striking from Paul Craig. Up until that point, it's mostly been ground fighting, grappling, and submission attempts. He was able to sub Vinicius Moreira, rear naked choke 10 months ago. That was the fight before Rua. He was knocked out pretty quickly, starched by Alonzo Menafield. He subbed Kennedy Nzechukwu, Nigerian fighter. And then he was subbed by Jimmy Crute. That was a pretty nasty Kimura there. So I think this is going to be one of the sloppiest fights on the card. And the reason for this is because I don't think either of these guys really have great striking. I think this is a fight where Craig would probably prefer to keep it striking because he probably has an advantage there. But I don't know if he's going to be able to put away Antigulov. I mean, I know we've seen Antigulov get knocked out in his last 2 fights, but Kutalaba and Oleksiejczuk, both those guys are much more polished strikers than Paul Craig. What I expect to happen in this fight is I expect it to be sloppy. I think Antigulov is going to shoot for the takedown. That's all. That's his game. You're not going to see a ton of output from him. And up until this point, I haven't seen great takedown defense from Paul Craig. Paul Craig has a bunch of submission victories on his record, of course, but those are all a result of not all of them, but a lot of those were from him really just being taken down and then pulling subs from his back. We've seen him do that now multiple times in the UFC. I don't think Antigulov is going to put himself in bad spots, though. I think he's going to put on the pressure, try to take Paul Craig down, and I don't think he's going to go for submission attempts. I don't think he's going to go for some crazy reckless ground and pound. I think he's just going to kind of grind it out, try to leg hump him to victory. So the odds here, this is basically a pick'em fight. Antigulov is plus 105. Craig is minus 125. If I had to bet this fight one way or the other, I am betting on Antigulov. And I just want to pull up those stats to back up my claims. Paul Craig, 57% takedown defense. And only 21% takedown accuracy. So when I see that 57% takedown defense, and I see Antigulov is averaging close to 9 takedowns per 15 minutes, it's a no-brainer for me. Especially when both of their striking numbers aren't good. They're dead even in strikes landed per minute. They're dead even in striking accuracy. Antigulov, strikes absorbed is a high number, but he's faced tougher competition in the UFC so far, in my opinion. So, Paul Craig has a little bit of a height and reach advantage here, but he's not a good enough of a striker, in my opinion, to take advantage of it. So, yeah, I like Antigulov here. When it comes to DFS, sloppy fight. I don't want anything to do with it. Now, if Antigulov does what I think he has the ability to potentially do, he could certainly score like a ton of points in DFS, which at an 8,200 price point, we've seen it happen. When he fought Christensen, 99 points. Rogerio de Lima, 98 points. So like, if he's able to grab a couple takedowns, a few advances, who knows, maybe even sub Paul Craig, he's a guy that could be a card buster, because I don't think there's going to be a ton of exposure to him. So he's someone that if you have an extra, you got a little bit of money, and you have a tournament, and you're looking someone from the low 8, high 7 range, and you're trying to diversify your lineup, you can throw Antigulov in there and be fine. Paul Craig, I won't have any exposure to him. I think he'll have higher ownership than Antigulov. Just don't fall for that trap, guys. Just do not fall for that trap. Don't expect Paul Craig to put up unless there's some sort of Hail Mary submission, I just don't see him scoring a ton of points. I think he's going to be taken down at will. I think he's going to be pretty high owned, higher than you would expect. All right, so we will move on to the next fight here on the main card, which is Carla Esparza versus Marina Rodriguez. This fight's taking place in the strawweight 115-pound division. Marina Rodriguez, of course, is undefeated with a record of 12-0-2. Coming up against the veteran Carla Esparza, I guess the funniest thing about this fight is that Marina Rodriguez is actually the older fighter. And when I was doing some research and reviewing this fight, I was shocked to see that. Carla Esparza's on a nice little 3-fight win streak. Hasn't really fought the toughest competition, in all honesty. She beat Verna Jandiroba, who was undefeated at the time that fight took place, but no one really knows how good she is. She had a nice victory against Alexa Grasso, majority decision victory in that one, and that was impressive to me, man, because Grasso's a nice up-and-coming prospect with really polished striking, good boxing background. And then her most recent fight, which was 2 months ago, she beat Michelle Waterson. That was split decision victory. That was really tight. Really, it could have gone either way. For Marina Rodriguez, coming off of a draw, her second draw in the UFC, that was against Cynthia Calvillo. She had 2 wins against Tisha Torres and Jessica Aguilar, and then in her UFC debut, that was a draw to Aranda Marcos. So this is my take on the fight. Marina Rodriguez has a striking advantage. She has a size advantage. And so far, she hasn't been finished or even lost a fight in her professional career. So with all of those things in mind, you would think I would be leaning Marina Rodriguez. That's not certain. That's certainly not the case. I like Carla Esparza in this fight. And I like Carla Esparza in this fight because she's fought 2 pretty solid strikers in Michelle Waterson and Alexa Grasso, and she's able to defeat them. And the reason why she's able to defeat them is because of her wrestling, her ability to get this fight to the ground. And Marina Rodriguez doesn't have great takedown defense. I know if you look at the numbers, statistically, it's not bad, but really, a lot of those fights stayed standing. And I don't really know if there was a relentless pursuit in those fights of the takedown, like we're going to see from Carla Esparza. If Carla Esparza knows what's good for her, she's not even going to really attempt to strike with Marina Rodriguez here. She's going to go right in for that double leg or single leg and get this fight to the ground. And we've seen Marina Rodriguez kind of fade, which is why she has some draws on her record. She hasn't really been able to put together like 3 dominant rounds. So when you look at the betting odds, Carla Esparza is a pretty decent dog here at plus 150. And she opened up as plus 130. So money has rushed to Marina Rodriguez. But I think this is where we see a dog here pull out a victory. I like Carla Esparza by decision. When it comes to DraftKings, DFS, fantasy, of course, You know, a lot about what I said for Sabata applies here to Carla Esparza, and their price points are similar. So I think I'm going to have a lot of exposure to both those fighters, and I'll probably have some similar cards where I almost have all of the same fighters, but where I may have a difference is either Esparza in one and Sabata in the other, or vice versa. And the reason for that is because if my other fights hit, you know, 30 points is a lot when you're playing these tournaments. So if you can get that decision victory, those 30 extra points from a fighter, that goes a long way. Now, I think both of those fighters, Sabata and Esparza, will win. So hopefully I'm good in, you know, regardless of the scenario. But they're both dogs, and I don't get them all right. So I'll have exposure to both of them. I won't have any exposure to Marina Rodriguez at 8,600. Just, I don't expect to finish. And if she doesn't finish, we're not going to see a ton of points. I mean, her one fight against Aguilar, she did have 118 significant strikes, which is crazy. Put up 104 fantasy points. But outside of that, you know, her draw against Marcos, 35 points. Her most recent fight against Calvillo, 28 points. 77 points against Tisha Torres, solid output there. But, you know, Tisha's such a small fighter. She is strong. She had trouble getting Rodriguez to the ground. And she was kind of more so just happy to swing back and forth with her. So Marina Rodriguez is a hot prospect, and if she pulls off a victory against Esparza here, she's going to be on that short list of contenders. But the UFC has a funny way of just kind of humbling you. And just when you think you're reaching that pinnacle and you're looking at a fight against a fighter that's like 4 or 5 inches shorter than you, and it's maybe an opponent that you could potentially look past, that's when, you know, the UFC competition catches up to you. You can't look past Carla Esparza. I know she's not like the fanciest fighter, but at the end of the day, she's been in the ring with Joanna Jędrzejczyk and other really tough competition. So, yeah, get a little bit of exposure to Carla Esparza in your lineup. All right, so the next fight here on the main card is Fabricio Werdum versus Alexander Gustafsson, which is taking place in the heavyweight division. Yes, that's right. Alexander Gustafsson will be making his heavyweight debut. And who knows, maybe he'll end up staying here. I think a lot of that decision will probably be dependent on his performance in this fight against Fabricio Werdum. Both these fighters coming off of 2 losses. Werdum, split decision loss to Alexei Olenek, and I gave that fight to Olenek. Olenek dominated him standing on the feet. Was also knocked out by Alexander Volkov. For Gustafsson, on the other hand, was subbed by Anthony Smith and knocked out by John Jones. Both 2 and 3 in their last 5 fights. I mean, these guys are really mirroring each other. I think the difference is Gustafsson's just fought more difficult competition. 3 years ago, that knockout against Glover Teixeira, I mean, he just looked so impressive. He beat Jan Blachowicz. I mean, it was shaping up to be another decent fight against John Jones, and of course, everyone remembers the first time Gustafsson fought John Jones. For Werdum, he hasn't really been successful in close to 3 years. He subbed Walt Harris, armbar. He won by decision against Tybura. I mean, let's just chalk it up to Werdum's basically 43 years old at this point. He just doesn't look like the same Werdum that was at one point the heavyweight champion and really dominating the heavyweight division in the UFC. Gustafsson really hasn't looked like himself recently either. Anthony Smith landed a big shot on him and rear naked choke, subbed him. Maybe we can call that an outlier, though, because even the John Jones fight, it took John Jones a little bit of while to finish him off. And then, of course, like I mentioned, those fights against Glover and Jan Blachowicz where Gustafsson looked impressive. Even his fight against Cormier, it was impressive. It was a split decision loss for Gustafsson. So he's been on the wrong side of a few decisions. Really, the interesting thing here is that Gustafsson's stepping up to the heavyweight division, but he's still going to have a size advantage because he's just such a long and tall fighter. So maybe a taller fighter, longer reach. Definitely the more polished striker and the younger fighter by about 10 years. So, when I look at the odds here, I'm not surprised to see Gustafsson minus 350, despite it being his first fight in the heavyweight division. Verdum plus 290. You have to be crazy at this point to put money on Fabricio Verdum. 43 years old, has just looked completely washed in his most recent UFC fights. And if you're going to get outstruck by Alexei Oleinik, that's a problem. He was a pretty big favorite in that fight because, Alexei Oleinik, his specialty is jiu-jitsu as well, and Verdum's one of the best in the world. So with that being said, you can't count Verdum out 100% because he can still sub you or just about anybody in the UFC if things go the right way. But I don't see that happening. And Gustafsson has really good jiu-jitsu himself. So it's not like, like the thing with the Walt Harris fight. Just Walt Harris doesn't have the jiu-jitsu skills that a guy like Alexander Gustafsson does, right? So he goes into that fight, he tries to throw some big shots, he doesn't land the shots, Verdum takes him down and subs him. Really easy. I don't see that happening in this fight against Gustafsson. I think Gustafsson is the more polished striker. I don't think he'll put himself in those positions. And even if he does, I think he's good enough to not only defend, but could potentially threaten a submission back. So I really like Gustafsson in this fight. I think he should be able to finish Verdum at this point. I mean, this might be Verdum's last fight in the UFC. I mean, if he takes another bad loss and looks the way that he looked in his previous two fights, I mean, can you really throw him out there with another name? I mean, I know he's a name, but at this point, there's nothing, he's not going to contend for a title. So Verdum, in my opinion, if he loses this fight to Gustafsson, should really retire. And on the flip side, if Gustafsson looks super impressive, I think he should give a heavyweight division another go. I think he should definitely have another fight in the heavyweight division there against a tougher opponent. And if he looks as good as he could potentially look against Verdum, then you might have a contender in that heavyweight division there, which would be nice. The other thing with Gustafsson is what Alexander Gustafsson are you going to get, right? Because if his heart's in it, he's one of the best fighters on the planet. If the Gustafsson that showed up against Anthony Smith shows up against Verdum, then there could be some trouble there. But I just don't expect to see back-to-back performances like that. Especially because he's coming out of retirement, so he should be pretty well trained up for this fight. I just want to pull up some stats here for these two fighters. Gustafsson averaging 4 significant strikes per minute, 40% striking accuracy, 3.44 strikes absorbed. For Verdum, 3.61 significant strikes landed per minute, 52% striking accuracy, 2.62 strikes absorbed per minute. Their grappling numbers are pretty similar. Both of them averaging a little bit less than 2 takedowns per 15 minutes. Takedown accuracy, Gustafsson has a 39% advantage to Verdum's 31%. Where you see a big difference here, though, is takedown defense. Gustafsson's just a hard fighter to take down. Unless you catch him and then take him down, he was able to stuff takedowns by John Jones and Daniel Cormier, and Cormier eventually got him to the ground, but 85% takedown defense looks good, and I think that will translate to the heavyweight division because of his length. The takedown defense of Verdum at 31% is not very good. I wouldn't imagine Gustafsson would try to take the fight down just because, that's where Verdum has an opportunity to pull out a sub. But yeah, when I look at this fight, I just think you'd have to be crazy to bet on Verdum. So I really like Gustafsson here. And from a DFS perspective, I really like Gustafsson as well. Because at 9,300, he could certainly pull off a finish here. I think he could easily knock out Verdum. If we see the same striking from Verdum that we saw against Alexei Oleinik versus Alexander Gustafsson, it is going to be it's going to be a short night for Fabricio Verdum, because I would expect Gustafsson to TKO him. 9,300, really like him. Verdum at 6,900. I wouldn't be surprised if he got some exposure. There's going to be guys out there that think, Gustafsson's coming out of retirement. Verdum, always dangerous with his submission skills. At 6,900, how could you pass on him? Again, it's a trap fight. There is a reason why his salary is 6,900. And look no further than his 2 most recent UFC fights. And when I pull up the numbers for Verdum, 58 fantasy points, 65 fantasy points, and that's when he was, against Oleinik, a pretty big favorite, 9,200 salary. So, and really, the Volkov fight before that was a five round fight. So 58 points in 4 rounds isn't very good. Stay away from Verdum. For Gustafsson, on the other hand, I know he's had some tough outings there against John Jones and Anthony Smith, but 120 points against Teixeira, 81 points against Jan Blachowicz, 75 points against Cormier. So, a little bit of a skid here for Gustafsson, but I think he's able to get back on the right track. So I really like Gustafsson in this fight. We'll move on to the co-main event, which, last Wednesday, was it last Wednesday? Yeah, last Wednesday, I said the worst co-main event fight, maybe of all time, Tim Elliott versus Ryan Benoit. This could potentially be in the running for worst co-main event. If you look at it face value, Shogun Rua versus Little Nog, Antonio Rogerio Nogueira, you're like, this is, a great fight. Yeah, 10 years ago, it's a great fight. These guys are both, they're on the edge of glory, right? Like, these guys just need to retire. And the crazy thing is, I say that, but Shogun hasn't really been that bad lately. His last 5 fights, he's 3-1-1. Draw against Paul Craig. He knocked out Tyson Pedro. He lost to Anthony Smith. He knocked out John Vellante, and a split decision victory to Corey Anderson 4 years ago, which he was 34 then. He's now 38 years old. For Little Nog, he's 2-3 in his last 5 UFC fights. He has not been very active, which isn't surprising for a 44-year-old fighter. Fighting in the light heavyweight division. Knocked out by Ryan Spann. He knocked out Sam Alvey. Or no. Yeah, he did knock out Sam Alvey. I'm just checking here. Ryan Bader knocked him out. Patrick Cummins, he was able to knock out. And then, of course, when these 2 guys fought close to 5 years ago, Shogun beat him unanimous decision. This will now be the 3rd fight between these guys, and Shogun has beaten him the first 2 times. I don't expect much to change here. When we look at the Vegas odds, Shogun is -185, Nogueira is +160. That sounds about right, because at the end of the day, these guys are, old fighters. Both of them should probably retire after this fight. I believe Nogueira has come out and said that this will be his last fight in the UFC. That's not a good sign. I don't like betting on fighters that are about to retire. They already have 1 foot out the door. And Nogueira's got more than 1 foot out the door. He's got 1 foot and 4 toes out the door. So, he's close to having 2 feet out the door. I just couldn't bet on him. But on the flip side, I wouldn't feel comfortable -200 Shogun Rua. Is that split decision draw with Paul Craig impressive? No. The Tyson Pedro victory seems impressive. It's already almost been 2 years, and Tyson Pedro tore his ACL in that fight. So, I don't think I'll be betting this fight at all. And these guys are both strikers. They're both going to be winded early. This is just going to be a sloppy fight. It will probably go the distance. I don't see a finish in this one. I just see a sloppy fight. Maybe Shogun comes out early and tries to drop some bombs, and then from that point on, just not a ton of output, which is another reason why I don't like this fight in DraftKings either. Shogun at 9,000, for what reason? 21 points against Craig, 94 against Pedro, 2 against Anthony Smith, and then beyond that, you're looking at fights that took place in like 2016, 2017. You know, he put up 122 points against John Vellante, who's just a bum, and then 74 against Anderson, 73 against Nogueira the first time around. For Nogueira, 7,200 is his salary. 3 points against Spann, 93 against Alvey, 1 against Bader, 115 against Cummins, 32 against Hua. I mean, neither of these guys are doing anything for me here. I don't think I will have any exposure in this co-main event. Didn't have any exposure in Elliott versus Benoit. That was fine by me. We saw how that fight went. Went the distance. Elliott got a split decision victory, didn't put up a ton of points. I see the same thing here. I think Shogun Hua probably wins by decision, lands anywhere from 40 to 50 significant strikes, and you're looking at, 55 to 60 points at most. So, yep, I'll be fading that fight all night. Moving on to the main event, which is the fight that I wanted to, I really look forward to talking about most here. That, of course, is Robert Whittaker versus Darren Till. That fight is taking place in the middleweight division. It looks like Darren Till is here to stay in the middleweight division, which makes sense for a guy of his size. Robert Whittaker, of course, coming off of a loss to Israel Adesanya, was knocked out in that one. Before that, Whittaker was the champ. He had back-to-back victories versus Yoel Romero. He also knocked out Jacare, knocked out Derek Brunson. So he's fought the who's who in the middleweight division. For Darren Till, he's coming off of a split decision victory against Kelvin Gastelum, which was his first fight as a middleweight. If you want to consider Kelvin Gastelum a middleweight, because he's also another guy with lightweight ties. Before that was just starched by Jorge Masvidal, knocked out. He was subbed by Tyron Woodley after being damaged in that fight. And then, of course, he had a couple impressive victories there. He knocked out Donald Cerrone, Cowboy, who hasn't knocked out Cowboy, and the decision victory to Stephen Thompson, which I think he lost that fight. That fight took place in London. He was the main event there. I think there was a little bit of home cooking there. So I think Darren Till is probably one of the more overrated fighters in the UFC. Technically, he's got really good striking, but he doesn't have much of a chin. The way he kind of bobs in and out in fights, he's always susceptible to being caught on the chin. So maybe it's not really his chin. Maybe it's just him putting himself in bad positions. And that fight against Kelvin Gastelum was a snooze fest, man. It just didn't impress me, and I get it. Like, you're moving up to the middleweight division, you're fighting someone with serious power after just being knocked out as a lightweight and finished as a lightweight multiple times. Maybe you are going to be a little bit cautious. And I hope for the sake of this card, Darren Till, I want him to fight smart, but I don't want him to fight the same fight he fought against Kelvin Gastelum, because I don't think that type of fight will benefit him. One, I think he'll lose and he really needs a victory here. But two, he had a significant size and reach advantage against Gastelum. So, and in this fight against Whittaker, it'll be pretty even. So if he's super cautious, Whittaker's an aggressive fighter, man. Like, he's going to bring it to you no matter what. I mean, that's what he did against Romero. And Whittaker's used to those types of fights. Right? He had those 2 fights against Yoel Romero, where Yoel Romero is going to have periods of time with not a ton of output, and he's going to fight very defensive. When I look at the Vegas odds in this one, this is pretty close. Whittaker's minus 120, Darren Till is even at plus 100. Let's get back to Robert Whittaker here, though. That fight against Israel Adesanya wasn't too hot, man. And I was really hoping Whittaker would win that fight. But it was clear that he was at a significant disadvantage in the striking department against Adesanya. The other thing, though, is that was the first fight that Whittaker had taken for well over a year. Yeah, well over a year because of the injury. So, you know, that could have had something to do with it, right? Was it ring rust? I don't know. I don't know if I buy into the whole ring rust thing, but it was pretty evident when they stepped into the ring that Adesanya and his ability to counter-strike, he had a big advantage in the striking department there. And I just don't think Whittaker fought that fight the right way. You saw Romero had more success against Adesanya. Now, there wasn't a ton of output, but, you know, if you're going to get into a counter-striking, or if you're going to be aggressive and allow Adesanya to counter-strike, that's the type of fight that he's looking for. So I think Whittaker fought right into the hands of Adesanya in that fight. And I think hopefully he learns from his mistakes. I think Darren Till is similar in that regard, that he wants to counter-strike as well. I don't think he has the same level of skill as Adesanya. I don't think he has the same level of finishing ability as Adesanya. You know, finishing Donald Cerrone is just, again, not that impressive to me. The guy's been around for forever. And Darren Till's a 185er fighting a 155er, right? Cowboy fights at 155. He's fought at 155, so he just had a huge size advantage there. Let's pull up some of the stats here for Whittaker versus Till. This one, again, I expect to stay standing for the majority of the fight. Whittaker, 4.77 significant strikes landed per minute, 39% striking accuracy, 3.7 strikes absorbed. For Darren Till, 2.41 strikes landed per minute, 46% striking accuracy, 3 strikes absorbed. You can look at the grappling numbers, not much to see here. Both of them average less than a takedown per 15 minutes. Their takedown accuracies are pretty similar, 57% for Whittaker, 41% for Darren Till, and then their takedown defense is almost identical, 84% for Whittaker, 82% for Till. So I really like Robert Whittaker in this fight. I think he has a ton of power here. You know, if Masvidal is going to put you out and Woodley's going to damage you, then I can't imagine what will happen if Robert Whittaker lands one on the chin of Darren Till. So at minus 120, I think it's a no-brainer. Really like Robert Whittaker in this fight. When it comes to DraftKings, I like Robert Whittaker here as well. He's got a ton of finishing potential. He's in a 5-round fight. It scares me a little bit that he was finished in his last fight against Adesanya, but it's not like we've seen Whittaker finished a bunch in the UFC, right? He was knocked out by Stephen Thompson way back in the day, in 2014. So Whittaker has the finishing ability. The fight's going 5 rounds, and he's cheap. And he's cheap because it's a close fight, right? Like, at least the odds would suggest it. So Whittaker at 8,300, someone that he's probably going to be one of my core guys I'll have a lot of exposure to. Darren Till is someone that I think I'll have a little bit of exposure to as well. Because if this fight does go the distance, Darren Till is the more technical striker. So I could see him having more output, landing more strikes. I could see it being a close fight, and the nod, you just never know with these judges, especially international. The nod could be given to Darren Till. So at 7,900, I just think Darren Till's going to be very high owned. But at 7,900, you could certainly do worse, right? You could certainly do worse, especially because it is a 5-round fight. We just haven't seen a ton from Till lately, fantasy-wise. 53 points against Gastelum, and that was in a victory. Only 36 significant strikes and 1 takedown. 26 points against Masvidal, a 0 spot against Tyron Woodley, 59 spot and a victory against Thompson. So really, Darren Till has never been a great fantasy performer in the UFC outside of his victory against Donald Cerrone, where he knocked out Donald Cerrone, put up 112 points. Because before that, it was 3 decisions in a row. So actually looking at the numbers, it makes me like Darren Till even less. It's still a 5-round fight though, so it's still someone that, if you're looking to diversify your lineups, he's a guy that you can get in there and definitely fit in almost any lineup. So again, I'm not going to rule him out and say I won't have any exposure, but probably 80-20 Whittaker to Whittaker versus Till. All right, so now we're going to move into everyone's favorite segment, the best segment. This is the money-making segment. And again, I was able to cash last week with my lineup, which was nice. So what is my lineup looking like this week? And I am going to open that up for you guys. So I will be having Khamzat Chimaev at 9,800, so I won't be fading him. I'm going to lock him in for the 100, at least 100 guaranteed points. Alexander Gustafsson, 9,300. And now you're probably thinking like, whoa, this guy's crazy. How does he have Chimaev and another 9,000 fighter? I'm going to let you know how. My next fighter will be Robert Whittaker at 8,300. 5-round fight, really good finishing potential. We've seen him have 94 fantasy points against Romero, 108 against Jacare, 117 against Brunson. I will also have Jai Herbert at 7,700. Again, Trinaldo definitely on the back 9 of his career. Herbert's been on a nice winning streak. Really has been able to finish some decent opponents in Cage Warriors. After Jai Herbert, I will have Peter Sabata at 7,500. Again, this is a fight that I think goes the distance, and I think Sabata has a chance of winning. And then the last fighter will be Mike Grundy at 7,100. Another fight that I expect to go the distance, but Grundy has a power advantage, and so far Grundy hasn't been taken down in the UFC, and Evelev has. So if Grundy can take down Evelev, he can grind out a decision. If it stays standing, they'll both hopefully put up some points. We really haven't seen Grundy finished. And, hopefully Evelev just opens up that window of opportunity for Grundy to land an overhand right and finish the fight. So, as always, guys, it's been a nice breakdown here. Let's keep the hot streak rolling. Let's win some more money this weekend for this Fight Island card. Tune in next weekend where we'll be doing it all over again. Peace.